think we're ready to go. Evening, everybody. My name is Mike Moore. I'm the dean at Northern Seminary, which is out here in Chicago. And I'm coming to you from Chicago itself. The campus is actually located in Lisle, which is about 30 miles west of the city. And I'm excited tonight to have Reverend Dr. Ryan Burge with us to present some of his work that he's been doing. Before we start and we hear from Ryan, first of all, I want to say thank you to the Great Rivers region of the American Baptist Church. I think Ryan, you're ordained in the ABC, right?
I've never been ordained. I was a pastor in the ABC for 20 years, okay. But I never got ordained, which I had a conversation about this weekend.
We need to have another webinar about that.
Hey, I did everything a pastor did. I just wasn't reverend. So,
well, hey, I called you reverend in the intro, so
you wouldn't be. It happens probably once a week, and I just kind of let it go at this point. So, fake news. # fake news.
Well, we want to thank the ABC Church, Great Rivers region, especially Patty King Bilyeu and the Shurtleff Fund for not just making this webinar happen, but helping make Ryan's research happen and providing some resources for that. Little intro time here for you, Ryan. I'm going to read a bio that you probably know better than I do. But for those of you who are uninformed, Ryan Burge is an associate professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University, where he also serves as the graduate coordinator. What does a graduate coordinator do?
I basically do all the admissions for the graduate program, answer all the emails, do all the advising, work on graduate assistantships to fill those contracts out, all that kind of fun paperwork stuff.
Oh, yeah. I do some of that too. He has authored over 30 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters alongside 4 books about religion and politics in the U.S. And you've maybe seen his work in the Times, Politico, Wall Street Journal. If you're like me, when I told people about this webinar, they said, "Oh, the graph and religion guy." So if you want to read more about Ryan and check out his work, you can go to graphsaboutreligion.com. All right. While Ryan's doing his presentation, which will last probably for about 30-45 minutes, feel free to shoot your questions in here. And when he's done, I'll volley the questions out there and we'll have a conversation. So thanks, Ryan, for being with us tonight.
Yeah, and thanks, Mike, and thanks ABC, and thanks GRR, and thanks Northern for all this. I mean, just so you all know, behind the scenes, they provided some money to make the survey bigger, which is really exciting. So now we have like 12,000 non-religious people and like 3,800 religious people. It's a huge survey at the end of the day, which is awesome because we can do more with it. And that's really the goal of the whole thing, is to do more with this kind of work. So just to kind of tee it up, Tony Jones and I, Dr. Tony Jones has a PhD in theology from Princeton. We got a Templeton grant about 18 months ago to do a 3-year project. And the centerpiece of that project is to do a survey. And the survey was the one we just talked about. It's a survey of non-religious Americans. The topic of the survey is making meaning in a post-religious America. And really our goal in that project was to create a new typology of non-religious Americans. So what you're going to see today is our very first cut at that issue. Big disclaimer here. I've not worked this data over as well as I would like to. This is a process that takes months to figure out. And I've got another book that's due January 1st that I've been working on pretty exclusively this year. But as soon as that book's sent off, then I'm going to pivot pretty hard to this project that we're going to write, Tony and I, in the new year. So this is really the first cut at the data. I haven't thought it through as well as I should have, to be honest with you. Some of the questions you might have for me actually might be questions I write down to go answer later on if I can. So, think about it like this. This is like a comedian who just did an HBO special and now has to start from scratch. So now this is like, going into the Laugh Factory with having 12 minutes of material, trying to see what works and what doesn't work. So all that to say, like, you're going to see something in the very embryonic stage of development. What actually ends up in the book, I think we'll be close to this, but I can't say 100% sure that this is exactly what's going to end up in the book when it comes out probably 2 years from now. So just keep that in mind as we're working through this data, that this is a very first cut at the data. So can you put that up on the screen for me? Oh, thank you, sir. That is delightful. So let's get right to it, shall we? Okay, so for those of you who are methodologists or thinking about being methodologists and want to know how we got this done, the 12,076 is not correct because it's actually 15,200 and 3,000. Well, anyway, it's over 15,000 adults. I got to fix that. We use Qualtrics, which is a survey platform that I use for a lot of my academic work, and continuing to use it for other projects I'm working on. It's considered to be academically rigorous and scientifically valid. It's not cheap, but we think it's worth the cost because we think this data has a higher quality than like using, for instance, SurveyMonkey or some other platform that you use for free. So here's what we did. We had a little over 12,000 non-religious Americans. And we used the old Pew typology to get people into the non-religious category. These are people who said they were atheist, agnostic, or claimed no religion in particular. Okay. That categorization scheme was, again, devised by Pew about 20 years ago. And we've been using the same scheme for a long, long time now. And one of the impetus behind this project was to realize the nuns have gone from 5% of America in 1991 to 30% of America today. And we're still using, these really blunt categories to describe non-religious Americans. So we need to work our way through a new way to understand non-religious people. So we used those 3 categories to create the nuns category, but then we're going to use those people who are non-religious and create new categories on the other side of that. We also did a survey of 3,282 religious Americans, but we are not going to talk about that today. That's going to be part of the book, is comparing the nuns to religious people on a bunch of these metrics, but that's a down the road thing. This survey was in the field from April 22nd, 2024 through May 5th, 2024. So it was open for about 2.5 or 3 weeks, which is not atypical for a survey like this. It just took a long time to get this many people. Every Friday I'd get an update. We got this many completes and we got this many completes. It just took a while for Qualtrics to fill the buckets they needed to fill. And then once that was done, I conducted a number of data validation checks, including kicking out speeders. Those are people who took the survey too quickly, but also people who, like, for instance, we'd say, like, check strongly agree for this one. And if they didn't check strongly agree, we kick them out and then replace them with a new person in the survey. All that to say, I feel reasonably confident in this data that it's pretty darn good. I've always strived to have data that I think meets academic standards, and I think we've done that in this survey. Again, it wasn't cheap, but we're glad we got to get the funding from Templeton and from GRR to make it happen. So, okay. So really the method that we used here is a very similar method to what we used in The Great De-Churching, which is a book that I helped write with Michael Graham and Jim Davis, which came out last August. What we did was we took those nuns, those 12,000 or so nuns, and then we put them through an algorithm called k-means clustering, okay? And what that algorithm does is it just looks for patterns in the variables and tries to find ways to separate them into distinct groups based on like-mindedness on certain variables, okay? It's important to note that this process is atheoretical, meaning this algorithm doesn't even know what each number means in each variable. Like, it doesn't know that white is 1, 0. Actually, we didn't even include race, but like attendance is 1 through 6. All it sees is numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 for attendance. It doesn't even know what attendance is. It doesn't know what views of the Bible are. It doesn't know what belief in God is. All it's looking for is patterns in those numbers, in those variables that will create coherent categories. So what we do then after the fact, after it creates these categories, is come in and try to figure out why it did that, why it created those categories, what factors mattered the most, which ones didn't matter. And I was actually I'm always struck by what factors actually end up being really strong sorting factors and which factors don't end up being sorting factors. Lots of things that I think are really good don't end up being good, and then vice versa. So this algorithm is used a lot in the business intelligence world. For instance, if you have like a shopper's card at the grocery store, we have a Kroger where I live, and if you scan your Kroger card, it will give you, deals on certain items. Well, the reason Kroger does that is because they want to be able to link your purchases to you as an individual And then they use those purchases and they put you in this K-means clustering algorithm to figure out what type of consumer you are, and then send you coupons based on your purchasing history and what you might want to purchase in the future. It's used in colleges for recruitment techniques. What students are in that kind of cluster and that kind of cluster. So what I love about it is, it's like I said, there's no bias in the algorithm. It does not see religion. It does not understand religion. All it's looking for is commonalities in the data. And then it's our job, Tony and I, to come in and look at the data after the fact and then try to figure out, what each of these clusters are, what they mean, how they're different than the other clusters. And actually, just this week, we changed what we called one of the clusters based on some analysis that I put together for this presentation. So we're still I feel reasonably sure that these are the 4 clusters we're going to end up with, but I'm not 1,000% sure this is where we're going to end up with. The more I look at the data and cut things and change things and think over what some of these clusters mean. So here we go. These are the 4 types of non-religious Americans. We created 4 categories because that made the most sense. Using a bunch of different statistical techniques, we can get you to the right. There's no right number of clusters, by the way. It could have been 3, it could have been 5. We had 4 for the Great Dechurching. We have 4 for this, and I feel reasonably good about these 4 categories because the smallest one still represents about 11% of non-religious Americans. So it's not like there's one really, really small category, then a bunch of big categories. They all are encompassing a lot of people. So here's our 4 categories. Starting in the top left, we call them Ninos, N-I-N-O-S, nuns and name only. I'm going to go into detail, and each one of these is going to get a slide here in a minute so you can kind of get some more detail about what each of these categories is. But this is the one that really surprised me the most because these are people who look like religious people in a whole bunch of ways. They just don't describe themselves as, they don't say they're Protestant or Catholic or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist. They say they're atheist, agnostic, or they have no religion in particular, which is really frustrating because you want these are actually religious people in a lot of ways. The second category is one you might have heard before, spiritual but not religious. We call those SBNRs in the literature. That's actually a term that's been used a lot by other scholars. And I was actually really pleased to see that the intuition that a lot of those scholars had about SBNRs actually showed up in the data in a very real way. And that's reassuring in a bunch of ways, because now it's like, okay, we're on the right track here. The third category, it looks like a hockey logo. I don't really know why, but I put all these into ChatGPT and it made these logos for me. So this is what you get. We're actually going to hire a designer to make logos for the website later on. So these are just kind of placeholders for right now. We call them zealous atheists. And this is, like I said, this is the smallest of the 4 categories that makes up about 10 or 11% of non-religious people. And this is the one that really surprised me probably the most out of all 4 of them. It's not one that we had talked about before. It's not one that we really thought a lot about before. It's not one that I've seen well conceptualized or well described in the literature. So this is like a brand new one. And I think it's really going to start a lot of conversations about what this group is and what they mean. As I show you some data down the road here, you're going to see that this group is definitely different than the other groups. And then the last one is the Duns. This is one we actually changed the name of just this week based on some more analysis that I was working my way through. These are people who are literally they are done with religion, and they're done with spirituality too. That's actually the really, really intriguing part of this group to me. Whenever we started working on this project, it's actually called the Spiritual Yearning Initiative. That's what Templeton's calling our project. And then there's 10 or 12 other projects they funded during this funding cycle. And the Spiritual Yearning Initiative actually at its core had one question that we talked a lot about when I was in San Diego with the group back in June. And that was, do people yearn for God or yearn for spirituality or yearn for religion? And what we found in this data is there's a significant chunk of non-religious people who do not seem to yearn that much for religion. They don't care about it. They're done with it. At one point, we called them laissez-faire nuns because they just don't really care about anything. It looks like they're just chill. And so we're going to call them Duns from this point forward. And like I said, this SBNRs and the Duns have already existed in the literature. And I get asked about the Duns all the time when I give talks about non-religion and secularization and things like that. So it's really nice that, again, that the Duns match a categorization that we've talked about before that exists, that the scholars have already talked about. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to take you through each of these 4 categories, kind of giving you the broad, like the really like 10,000 foot view of each of them. Then I'll show you some graphs about how they differ on some really key variables. So let's start with our Ninos, our nuns in name only. About 1 in 5 non-religious Americans falls in the Nino category. Like I said, this is a category that is really frustrating because I think a lot of these people are just, they don't like the religious label, but they are religious and spiritual in very significant ways. So I think it's really helpful to talk about using the old Pew typology. If you read any of my books before, you know that the old Pew typology, like the nothing in particulars, are a totally different group than atheists or agnostics. The nothing in particulars tend to be a lot less turned off to religion. They seem to be somewhat spiritual in some ways. And what's really interesting is amongst the Ninos, about 75% of them identified as nothing in particular, which means they're sort of in that middle ground of they're not really religious, like they're not Protestant or Catholic or Jewish, but they're also not nuns either. You know, they're kind of like, they're not atheist agnostics. They're kind of in this weird middle ground. And that's exactly what this group is. They stand between the 2 poles of secularism on one side and religion on the other side. On a scale from 1 to 10, they put religious importance at 5.7, which is the highest of any group by a long shot. And then on spiritual importance, they put it at 8.7 out of 10, which again was the highest of any of these 4 types of nuns by a long shot. They are fairly religious, and actually among the nuns, they're incredibly religious. 32% of them attend religious service at least once a year. So again, that's kind of what we saw, by the way, with nothing in particular, is they're not completely turned off to religion. You're seeing that here again. Half of them pray every day. And then 47% of them believe in God without a doubt. So the portrait that's emerging for me from this group already, by just doing some preliminary analysis, is this group is actually, they're not done with God. They're not done with religion. They're not done with spirituality. They have a lot of, half of them have a believe in God without it. That's the highest, that's the most certain option you can give, by the way. So on that belief question, 50% of them score at the top on the belief metric. So that just shows you like how you know how much they believe in God and how religious and spiritual they are. But then I think that I'm going to show you this for every group, the trust religion part. Half of the Ninos say they trust religion not at all. So I think this is a group that is deeply religious, is deeply spiritual, but does not like the label of Protestant or Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or anything like that. They are religious, though, in every other way, at least in a way that comes close to what we would think the average American is when it comes to religiosity. They are not turned off to faith. They're actually, I would say, warm-ish to faith. So that's 1 in 5 nuns falls in the Nino category. Second category is our spiritual but not religious. And this is the largest group of nuns. About 36% of all nuns are SBNRs. That's the acronym that you see a lot in the data. SBNRs are spiritual but not religious. Now, this group, well, the prior group was about 75% nothing in particular. This group is about 50% nothing in particular, and then 35% agnostic, and then 13% atheist. So it's still a lot of nothing in particulars, but it's a bigger share of agnostics than I would have guessed going into this. But you can see why I call these people SBNRs, okay? Now, let me go back just real quick to show you. On spiritual importance, the Ninos were at 8.7. The spiritual but not religious are at 6.7. But look, the Ninos were 5.7 when it comes to religious importance. These guys are 1.8 when it comes to religious importance. So the biggest gap between those two numbers, the religious importance number and the spiritual importance number, is in this group right here, which is where they got their name from, because they score spirituality relatively high for being non-religious people, and then they score religion very low. Now, not as low as the next two groups, but much lower than the Ninos do, okay? So they are the kind of the classic, like, they don't do institutions at all. They're not down with, you know, being Protestant or Catholic. Remember, this group, 32% attended religious services at least once a year. Amongst this group, 93% services seldom or never, which means that only 7% of this group goes to church once a year or more. So incredible religious on this. And then you add the second layer to it, which is that 87% of them say they pray seldom or never. Remember, of this group, 53% of them pray at least once a day. And amongst this group, 87% pray seldom or never. So they're not traditionally religious, like in the Judeo-Christian way that we would think about it, with going to church and praying on a regular basis. And then when you look at the belief in God question, only 5% of them chose the most certain belief in God question. So they're not in the same planet as your Ninos are. They're probably their closest cousins, but it's certainly a very distant cousin. This group is still very spiritual, but in no way are they traditionally religious. And the fact that only 5% believe in God without a doubt, and 87% of them pray seldom or never, tells you very clearly where they are. And then 76% of them say they trust religion not at all. So that's even higher than our Nino group. That was 50% for the Ninos. It's 76%. So I think the clear pattern that emerges for me with SBNRs is they are people who practice they're spiritual, obviously, because they score at 6.5 out of 10, but they're not praying. They're doing, and this is something we're going to work on later on, how much they do things like we ask questions about yoga and crystals and meditation and tattoos and all kinds of non-traditional spirituality. I'm going to guess they're scoring very high on those metrics of non-traditional spirituality stuff. So, all right. Now, I think these two groups are, like I said, they're cousins. They're distant cousins. And then the next two groups are cousins, and they're in a different kind of like nuns category in my head. They look completely different. So this is a group I call zealous atheists. It's important to know that this is the smallest group we talked about. About 11% of all the nuns fit in this category, but I think this category is really, really important for a bunch of reasons, which I'm going to talk about when we get to the graphs here in a minute. The biggest chunk of zealous atheists are atheists. About 60% of them are atheists, and another 26% are agnostic. So over 80% of this group is atheist or agnostic. We would call those people secular people. Now, look, they score religion at 1.7, which is almost exactly like our spiritual but not religious. But then they score spirituality of 4.2 when the SBNR scored it a 6.5. So not only are they not very religious, they're actually another click down on the spirituality scale too. So 83% of them attend religious services seldom or never, which is actually higher than this group, which is really striking to me. 81% of them pray seldom or never. So again, very, very low metrics on traditional religiosity here. And then 4% of them believe in God without a doubt, that's the lowest we've shown you so far, is 5% here and 47% here. Here's really the defining characteristic of this group, which is the one that got them their name, zealous atheists. We ask every one of these non-religious people, have in the last 12 months, have you tried to convince someone to leave religion? And amongst this group, 76% of them tried to convince someone to leave religion over the last 12 months. That was far and away the highest of any of the clusters. Most of them were in the low single digits, like 5%, 3%. Amongst this group, the algorithm found that this one variable was incredibly important when it came to sorting these groups out. So the fact that I almost wanted to call them evangelical atheists, because it's like, they don't believe in religion and they don't want you to believe in religion either. So they're the ones out there proselytizing, evangelizing, trying to draw people away from traditional religion. 3/4 of them are trying to do that, and they're not very religious themselves, obviously. And they're obviously not very spiritual either, because they score 4.2 out of 10, which again is the lowest of the three groups I've shown you so far. Now, the next group is, like I said, I think this is the closest cousin to our zealous atheists, and this is a group that I'm thinking more and more about, which is the Duns. So 1/3 of all religious people are Duns. Remember, 36% were SBNRs, 33% were Duns, and then your Ninos are about 20%, and then your zealous atheists are about 10%. So this is the second largest group. About 1 in 3 non-religious people goes in this category. And what's interesting is if you look at how they're distributed, they're kind of evenly distributed across the 3 traditional categories. So 31% nothing in particular, 27% agnostic, and 43% atheist. They are actually the most evenly spread across those three categories of any of the groups that we looked at. But here you can clearly see here why we call this group the Duns. On a scale from 1 to 10, their religious importance is 0.2, like literally almost as low as it gets. So that's compared to 1.7, 1.8, and 5.7. You can see why we call these people Ninos, by the way, and how I think they're really religious, because that's way higher than the rest of the nuns. 0.2 out of 10. And then on spiritual importance, they score a 1.2 out of 10, which is 3 points lower than zealous atheists. It's 5 points lower than this, and it's 7 points lower than that. So that to me was how did I get to that nun category? When I saw that, and I saw some graphs I'm going to show you in a minute, it became clear as day to me that this is a group that is not yearning for God or faith or spirituality or religion or anything. 0.2 on religion and 1.2 on spirituality, when other groups are, 5 and 6 and 4. They're nowhere near that. 98% of them attend religious services less than once a year. And then 99% of them pray seldom or never. And 0.2% of them believe in God without a doubt. So, I mean, to me, this category makes a whole lot of sense in comparison to the other categories. And you can really see how the algorithm got us to this category, because these people are just, they're done, man. They don't care. They don't want anything to do with it. Now, the biggest difference between them and the previous category, zealous nuns, is the share of these people who try to convince someone to leave religion is less than 5%. So they're done and they don't care. They're not trying to convince you to be an atheist. They're not evangelical about it. They're kind of like mainline. They're like mainline nuns. They're like, well, you can do whatever you want, but here's what I believe. They're not out there telling you why you should leave religion. They're not debating with you on the internet. They just don't care about religion. And you can see in the bottom there, the very last statistic really tells the story. About 9 in 10 of them say they trust religion not at all. So they are, I mean, they're as far away from religion of any of these clusters, and it's not even close. Like, they are in a totally different atmosphere, universe from the other three types of nuns. So let me show you some graphs now to kind of see how these, we ask a bunch of questions on the survey about how they make meaning and how they find purpose and how they think about the afterlife and how they think about God and spirituality. And I'm just going to show you 5 or 6 graphs. So just to give you kind of a broad lay of the land, and then we can, obviously talk about that more a little later on. So here's the religious attendance piece that I was telling you about. So obviously the Ninos are in the top. I'm always going to put the Ninos in the top. I'm going to put these in order of the way I just described them to you, so it's easier for your head to kind of figure out where we are. So obviously you can see the Ninos are a totally different type of nun. Only 38% of them said they never attend religious services. That's 22 points lower than zealous nuns. Now, what's really interesting to me is the zealous nuns are actually slightly more likely to go to church than the SBNRs, which I haven't really figured out yet, to be honest with you. But I think part of it is that zealous nuns are still marginally attached to religion in a way that they go enough maybe with their parents or grandparents or spouse or someone that it makes them like religion less, but they still go based on social obligation or peer pressure or something like that. But even amongst the zealous nuns, 83% are attending never or seldom. As you can see, there's not any group here that's going a ton. So let's just be clear about that. Even amongst our Ninos, it's less than 15% are attending weekly or more. By the way, that's bizarre to think about. Like 13, 14% of Ninos are going to church once a week, which kind of fits the whole bill because they're nuns in name only. But 68% attend seldom or never, and 32% attend at least a little bit yearly or more. That's the highest by a long shot. SBNRs are very low attendance. And then you can see, obviously, the bottom rows there are duns. And I think this kind of crystallizes why they're duns. 90% of them never go to church. And then another 9% say they seldom go to church. So 1% of them go once a year. 1%. They are clearly the furthest away from religion. So when I think about this, the Ninos are closest and the duns are the furthest. And then I think we can have a real good debate about where the SBNR is versus the zealous nuns are. I don't feel real strongly about that just yet. So how often do they pray? Again, I mean, look at those Ninos, guys. Like, I think this to me is like the cleaving thing that caused the algorithm to create these different categories. Over half of them pray every day. But then you go right into the SBNRs, and 44% of SBNRs say they never pray, and 44% say they seldom pray. So about 9 in 10 of them, say they pray less than once a week. Amongst the zealous nuns, 56% never pray. Another 25% say they pray seldom. And you look at your duns there. Your duns, 88% of them pray never pray. And amongst them, 11% say they seldom pray. So almost all of them have no prayer life at all. It's really bizarre to like contrast them with the Ninos. And I think this is the problem. We mush everyone together into the big non-religious blob. Is we're throwing together people who are incredibly religious on one side, or actually fairly religious on one side, and not at all religious on the other side. And we're kind of putting them under the same big umbrella term of nuns. And it masks all these really important differences that lie below the surface. And I think they're really significant differences in thinking about them from just a social science perspective and a ministry perspective. You want to go down that road. The who you should target and how you should think about these groups is completely different. The duns, as far as I can tell, it'd be a waste of time to come back to religion. They've got nothing to do with it. The SBNRs and the Ninos, they might be a little bit a different story, at least more minimal. So how important is religion in your life? This is kind of a classic Pew question that's included on lots and lots of surveys, which I like. As you can see here, the Ninos, 22% of them say religion is very important, and then another 40% say religion is somewhat important. That means that 62% of Ninos say religion is somewhat or very important. That means above the average. So, I mean, from this perspective, it's hard to look at this group and say, yeah, they're not religious or not spiritual, or they don't care about God or faith. No, the majority of them clearly do, but they sort of stand out on this. Okay, so 51% of SBNR say not at all important. 61% of zealous nuns say not at all important. And then 94% of the duns say religion's not at all important. And another 4% say not too important. So, yeah, I mean, this is just kind of, it's going in the same direction that we saw the attendance data. It's going in the same direction we saw the prayer frequency data. This is all sort of cascading in a very consistent pattern, which is actually good, because that's what you want the algorithm to do, is create these really distinct and discrete categories. And I think it tells a really clear narrative about what's going on. And then spiritual importance. So this one is, I mean, the Ninos, 66% of them say spirituality is very important to them, that's huge. And then 30% say that it's somewhat important to them. And then SBNRs, it's 75% chose the top two options, somewhat or very important. Amongst the zealous nuns, it's 44%, so lower, but not super duper low. I think they're somewhat spiritual, these zealous nuns are. And then the duns, again, 70% of them say spirituality is not important. And then another 27% say it's not too important. I mean, look at this. 94% of them said religion is not at all important. And 70% of them said spirituality is not at all important. And they got nothing to do with it. What I did here is put them into one measure, so you can kind of see, what's going on here. I mean, you can pretty clearly see, and I marked the green where you got a lot of people clustered. And you can see in the Ninos where they're clustered. They're clustered in the top right. That's Ninos who are both very spiritual and very religious. I mean, those 4 boxes in the top right corner, that's over 50% of the sample. You're talking 40, now that's 61% of the sample in those top 4 boxes there for your Ninos. For the SBNRs, the top right is not full at all. There's nothing in the top right because religion is not important to them, or not somewhat important to them. It's just not on their radar. You can see where their scores are higher, or on the spirituality side, low on religion and high on spirituality. That's why I call them SBNRs. This actually was probably one of the most formative graphs for me in figuring out where these different groups are on these 2 dimensions, right, of faith. They are definitely high on spirituality, but they're definitely not high on religion. You can almost none of them pick somewhat or very important. And then with your zealous nuns, you can see that there's like the epicenter is in the bottom left. That's not at all spiritual and not at all religious. About 30% of them are in the not at all category. But there's a little spillover, 12% one tile up, and then 12% one tile up, and then 11% and 8% in those tiles over to the right. So they're definitely in the bottom left corner, but their scores are more distributed across that bottom left corner. It's not just like 1 squares, all of them or most of them. It's 5 squares where they can be found, not 1 or 2 squares. Now, For the Duns, you see the opposite of that. You basically see that 70% of them are in the bottom left corner. That's not at all religious and not at all spiritual, right? So that's the vast majority are in that one box, and you go one click up and you get 22% more. That's people who say they're not at all religious, and then not too spiritual. So 90% of people amongst the Duns are in those bottom two left categories. Well, they're not distributed out. The zealous nuns are a little warmish towards religion and spirituality, more so spirituality than religion. The Duns are not warm to either. They are done with religion, nothing to do with it. So we included a bunch of questions about psychological stuff, because one question we really had was, are the non-religious people really struggling mental health wise? You know, what are they doing in terms of mental health? And you can see here that the group that's most likely to agree with the statement, I feel I do not have much to be proud of, is the zealous nuns. This is a group that they're only 11% of the nuns, but if you look at other metrics, and I've looked at a bunch, I'm only showing you a few here. If you look at other mental health metrics and well-being metrics and things like this, I'm telling you, of the 4 types of nuns, the zealous nuns are doing the worst from a mental health perspective of all 4 groups. I mean, so what's really fascinating to me is the Duns are at the top of this graph and the zealous are at the bottom of this graph, and they're both the furthest from religion. So the zealous nuns are actually doing much worse from this perspective, from a purpose perspective, than the Duns are, even though their overall level of religion and spirituality is not that much different. So they're kind of evidencing this in different ways. There's another question like this. I feel that my life is not very useful. The one group that's clearly different than the other group on this question is the zealous atheists. Only 54% of them disagree with that statement. 31% of them say, I feel that my life is not very useful. That's 10 points higher than the rest of the nuns. So again, clearly on this metric, they are doing worse mental health wise and purpose wise and well-being wise than the rest of the nuns. Okay, so religion helps me answer. And then what is my purpose? What is the meaning of life? And who I am. What's really fascinating to me is how these 3 different questions get almost exactly the same responses from each of these groups. Like it's just it might deviate by 2 or 3 percentage points at the most. But you can see that Ninos, 37% of Ninos say that they agree with the idea that religion helps them find their purpose. 40% of them say religion helps them find the meaning of life. And 32% of them agree with it helps them find who they are. Amongst the Duns, 76% of them strongly disagree that religion helps them find their purpose. 75% with what's the meaning of life, and 77% for who I am. So you can really see these are the 2 polar opposites of the non-religious people. The Ninos still somewhat open to religion. The Duns clearly not open to religion. And then we asked that question with spirituality. Like, does spirituality help me answer what is my purpose? Again, you see a lot of the same thing here and very consistent answers. The Duns, it's not like the Duns are finding a lot of meaning and purpose in spirituality either. But what you can see with the SBNRs is only 26% of them disagree that spirituality helps me find my purpose. Only 26% of them disagree about meaning of life. Only 25% of them disagree with the question, spirituality helps me answer who I am. So you can see the SBNRs are a little bit more open to the idea of spirituality than they are to the idea of religion. But the Duns are they're not open to spirituality or religion helping them answer any questions about existential things in their life and their purpose. And then these are questions about the afterlife. Okay, so we asked, I think there was a series of 6, and I just showed you 3 here because they all kind of break out pretty similarly, which is really surprising to me. So we said, when you die, what's going to happen? Will you reunite with loved ones? And amongst the Ninos, 65% of them said they would reunite with loved ones. 26% of Ninos said, when I die, my existence ends. Half of Ninos said that when they die, they still exist somehow. So they kind of believe in a soul. It was only 30% of SBNRs, only 20% of zealous nuns, and less than 5% of Duns. You can really see here how, we thought like these afterlife questions were going to be very clarifying for us, like really like how much spirituality stuff do people think about? And you can see that a lot of these groups are actually somewhat believing in an afterlife, like 53% of them said, for instance, like, okay, when I die, my spirit or energy lives on. 55% of SBNRs agree with that statement. So 55% of them agree their spirit would live on, and a third of people were ambivalent about the question. Even amongst the zealous nuns, 38% of them agree with the statement that whenever they died, their spirit or energy would live on. So they still have yearning there. There's still like a spark, a little flicker. The pilot light is still on for them when it comes to religion. The Duns are not that way. 77% of them said, when I die, my existence ends. They agree with that statement. Like, that is how done they are. They're not spiritual, nor are they religious, nor do they think about the afterlife, nor is the pilot light is out. They are completely far away from religion. Remember, that's one third of the nuns fit in that category of being done. So I went for 41 minutes, Mike. So take that. Time for questions. If anyone wants to ask something, I'll do my best to try to think about answering. I don't know.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Check. You hear me? Did Mike go away? If Mike went away, this is going to end up being where he said his internet was being flaky earlier. And if that's the case, then I don't know what to do at this point. I guess you could slide into my DMs on Twitter and ask me a question there, and I could do it on the live stream. But it looks like Mike's kind of going in and out right now. Hold on. Let me check.
You still there, Ryan?
Oh, yeah. You're back. Hey, buddy.
I don't know where I went, but I had the spinning wheel of death, and I'm back.
All right, dude. You got any questions or comments or anything for me?
Yeah. I'll let you catch your breath here. Maybe grab a drink of water. Yeah. We had you going here for a little bit. I saw one question here in the chat, and I'm getting a few more in the there's some other platforms. So I'll start off by just setting it with one question. And for everybody else who's listening, feel free to send them in. I'm getting some text, some here in StreamYard, and some through some other sources as well. So first question, just like really wide, general. Did you have a hypothesis going into the study? And related to that, what surprised you from all the data? If there was like one big surprise.
My hypothesis was that the categories that we had used for so long were actually papering over a lot of really important distinctions. Like that nothing in particular category I knew was just sort of like a potpourri, like a really bad mismatch of people who are getting to the same label by completely different avenues. Like it's like you look at all the options and go, I don't like any of these options, but I can't say I'm Protestant because I'm not, or I'm not Catholic, or, whatever I have, but I'm also not an atheist either. Like I know what that word means. I'm not that thing.
Yeah.
And so I thought that what we were going to see is a lot more diversity in how people got to where they got to. And like, if you look underneath the surface, you're going to see a lot of so what surprised me then was how well the algorithm worked, to be honest with you. Like I really there's not a lot here that contradicts the other parts of that cluster, if that makes any sense. Like they're almost congruent perfectly. The zealous category is a little bit of an odd one because they tend to be a little more spiritual and religious than you think they would be, given the fact that 75% of them try to convince someone to leave religion. Right. But I think there's ways to explain that by looking at other data. Like for me, the zealous nuns are like your Reddit atheist trollers. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? They're the ones who are like young and kind of impressionable and like think they're smart. Like when they have the Dunning-Kruger effect really bad, which is like you want to call everybody Sky Daddy and be really super condescending and think you understand the world really well. And really you're just like rolling grenades in the room all day long. You're just a troll. Yeah. And you can see that in the mental health stuff that I showed you, just a little taste of it. But like one of the questions was, it feels good to be alive. They're the least likely to agree with that question. Mm-hmm. And that was really surprising to me that like the algorithm found those people. I think if you talk about religion and have a platform online to talk about religion, I kind of do, you get a lot of those people that slide. Like if I go on Reddit, like I did an AMA a while ago, it was miserable, dude, because it was all those people came out of the woodwork and just wanted to tell me how stupid I was.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's not a mature conversation, man. Like, that's not, I mean, if you're non-religious, that's cool. I'm a person of faith, obviously, but I'm not going to call you an idiot. So don't call me an idiot. But it's like, they feel like this drive to like troll, like they got too much 4chan in their lives. They got too much, anonymous in their lives.
Yeah.
And they need to figure out how to be cool with their, where they are spiritually without making everyone else feel bad and making themselves feel bad about it, by the way, because that's what the data says. So that was my biggest surprise, I guess.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah. If you go on Reddit, you will find a weird world with a lot of weird conversations happening all at once.
Yeah.
Talking about the zealous atheist, the first question that came in here through. You mentioned that they were cousins. I think you said the Duns and the zealous atheists. You mind kind of extending that and talk a little more about that?
Yeah. So I think both of those groups, we have a question about like how, like secular values, which is like, do you think like science is the best way to understand the world and like rationality matters the most and things like that? They scored both those groups scored relatively high on the secularism index, which means that they are emerging from they're not non-religious, they're secular. Like they've embraced secular values. They just live those values out in a completely different way. The Duns are just like, I don't care about religion, and I don't care if you care about religion. Like, do whatever you want. It makes no difference to me. While the zealous nuns are still somewhat, I think they're enough religious to make them mad, if that makes any sense. You know what I mean? Like, they rub up against it a little bit just to like get grumpy and go online and troll people. So I think when I say they're cousins, I think I see them as like almost like atheist agnostics. Like, like one, like the Duns are like your atheists, and your zealous atheists are actually your agnostics, because they're kind of like 10% less of everything except like 50% angrier. If that makes any sense. Like, I really do think at the core of the whole thing, they're actually very similar when it comes to like how their orientation of the world is. It's just how they manifest that and how they interact with other people is completely different. Kind of based on how social they are, I guess, about the whole thing and how much they care. I'm going to bet, and I haven't done this yet, but I'm going to look at the age data. I'm going to bet you $1 the zealous atheists are the youngest of the 4 clusters.
Yeah. So your intuition is that some of it might be how they're socialized or their maturity levels.
We also ask questions, by the way, about their parents.
Oh.
Like, what was your parents' religion growing up? How much did your parents go to church growing up? Would you have ever considered yourself an evangelical? And I think, I'd have to go look, but I think that the zealous atheists were more likely to be raised evangelical than the Duns were.
Oh, yeah. That might be why they are so evangelical about their.
Yeah, but I also think it's why they're so angry too. Because like evangelicals are loud. Let's be honest here. Like, they're very prominent on social media and in the discourse. I think this is the exact same thing. Like they left loud. They were mad with religion and walked away, and they want you to leave too. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's insightful. Next question we have is from Brad Donahoe. I know Brad. Hey, Brad.
Hey, Brad.
Thanks for joining us. Was there anything in the research that tried to get at why or how they came to their present relationship?
Yeah, so the focus of this project was not on why they left religion. If you want to look into that stuff more, go look at the Great De-Churching, because that's really the point of that book, is like trying to figure out why they left and then why they would come back. And that, by the way, that only looks at the behavior metric, which is like, did you go to church and now do you not go to church? This is about your belonging, which is like how you see yourself in the religious space. So there's a little bit of a difference there that really is important. What we're more interested in, and the Templeton thing is not, you got to remember, Templeton is not focused on evangelism. They're not a religious organization. They want us to describe the world as best we can and how these nuns make meaning. So really our more interest is not in how they got to where they were, but how they live in that space that they're in. Like, how do they find meaning and purpose, and what's their mental health like, and do they have a good sense of well-being, and those kind of things. Like, that was really the purpose of this specific study, which I think is an important hole to fill, right? One thing I talk to non-religious people all the time as part of this work, and I want them to know that I'm not always trying to think about ways to evangelize them. Like, that's just that they're not a project. You know what I mean? Like, they're not a crusade for me. Insofar as I'm trying to understand them, they're a crusade for me, but not necessarily in terms of trying to bring them back to a religious tradition.
Yeah.
Just trying to understand why they are what they are and how they get through life is an incredibly important, I think, laudable goal in this project.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's why it's a gift to the church, because it's helping the church understand who it is that we're talking about.
And also, I think the reason I'm postured this way too is so that the average consumer, like the person that reads the New York Times, the Washington Post, will be more willing to listen to me talk about this than like an evangelical organization
Yeah.
with this data, because they think it's automatically biased in a certain direction. Like
Right.
I'm really, the goal here is not to evangelize anyone. It's just to explain what the landscape of non-religious people look like. And also to raise my hand at some point and go, I think that's bad. Like when you look at certain parts of this data and go, man, the zealous atheists seem like they really are not doing well from a well-being perspective. That needs to be talked about and pointed out. And we're going to, obviously we've got that religious sample that we did part of the survey too. So part of this is going to say, what are the mental health of these types of nuns versus religious people? Like, is it worse? Is it better? On what metrics is it worse? Is it better? So that's the second layer to this whole thing too. We haven't even started that part yet.
Yeah. Well, that ties in actually to another question that I got sent to me. In the question I asked, why did you add mental health to the survey? 10, 15 years ago, it probably wouldn't have been a factor or a category we were measuring.
Yeah.
What was the impetus behind adding that?
Couple things. One was the idea of like spiritual yearning. Like, do people yearn? Like, if they don't yearn, are they mad? Are they upset? Are they angry? Are they kind of like nihilistic about the whole thing? So part of it was just trying to figure out that. But the other part of it is, I mean, obviously the metrics on mental health look worse now than they've ever looked before. And we're really trying to dig in and see like what religion has to do with mental health, or the lack of religion has to do with mental health. And I think those are, so the questions, we took a huge bank of questions from a survey called Monitoring the Future, which is what Gene Twenge wrote a book called Generations, which is just basically what it is. They surveyed high school eighth graders, 10th graders, and 12th graders. Every year, a new crop of high school seniors from 1976, they're still doing it. And so a lot of those questions were questions they ask of high school seniors. Like, do you feel meaning? Do you feel like you're left out of things? Do you feel lonely often? And I thought those were really great questions that try to like get to like the idea of like, do you think your life is bad? You know what I mean? Like, how do you feel about your life right now? Especially like in a post-COVID world where we're thinking about mental health more. I think it's really important for us to say like, okay, I really want to be able to tell people like, hey, the nuns are doing fine. If they're doing fine, or some nuns are doing fine, mental health wise, well-being wise, and some aren't. So let's talk about the ones that are struggling and try to figure out a way not to bring them back to Jesus and have him fix it, but just to like say, hey, you need help. Like you're lonely, you're depressed. Like, let's find ways to at least point you. And by the way, the outcome of this project is going to be a survey. You're going to be able to go to a website, take like a 20-question survey, and it's going to tell you what type of nun you are, and then point you to things like resources that might be helpful to you. Podcasts, books, Facebook groups, and even maybe some things where you need to be mindful of. Like in our survey, your group struggled on these metrics. Think about that. Like understand that you're not alone in this struggle, and you seem to be doing really well on these metrics. Is that true for you? So it also becomes like a self-evaluation process of like, okay, that makes sense to me. So that was really the part that got Templeton excited, I think, is the idea that they can take part in the survey in a way and figure out where they are too.
Yeah, that's great. I just learned the cool button to put the questions on the screen.
Put it up. Let's go.
We're gonna do questions here for another 5 or 10 minutes or so. This one comes from the north side of Chicago, up in Lakeview, from Joel Blunt.
Yeah.
I was surprised at how many people just don't seem to care about religion one way or the other. Is that just burnout or culture wars, or a broader secular trend that we should expect to continue?
I think this is always a helpful reminder that not everyone lives life the way that we live life. Like I know, Mike, you probably think about religion on a pretty regular basis, buddy.
Yeah.
And so do I. But here's the thing. I grew up religious. I grew up in a Southern Baptist household. I was a pastor for 20 years. I still go to church on a regular basis. I talk about religion every day in one way, shape, or form. You work in a seminary, So like for us, when you grow up in that world and you stay in that world, it's like you think that everyone thinks about the world the way that you think about the world, and what you care about. You're like, well, this is a universal thing. And the more and more I dig into this data, the more and more I came to the same conclusion from the comment that like a lot of people just don't give two rips about religion. Like it just doesn't affect their lives. And honestly, I think a lot of them want it to go away just because they don't care about it. Not to think it's like some nefarious evil force in the world. They just go, God, I wish you would quit talking about it. Like let's just move on from that conversation. And I think that is a really helpful corrective for people like you and I who swim in these waters all the time. Like I have to tell my political science undergrads all the time, no one follows the news as much as you follow the news. You know what I mean? Like no one is up on current events as much as you're up on current events. So let's get real about this stuff. You know what I mean? Like, so let's try to understand the world outside your bubble and your worldview. And what this is telling me pretty clearly is a lot of people don't seem to care about religion that much, which to me is a challenge and an opportunity if you're a person of faith, right? The challenge is like they're apathetic and that's bad. But the opportunity is they're apathetic, which is more than they hate it. Like that's actually probably means like they're not cold towards you, but they're not hot towards you either. They're sort of in the middle, like shaking their head, which means they're more persuadable than the duns are, because obviously the duns don't care. So I think in some ways it's like it's a double-edged sword. It's good and bad.
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah. I oftentimes have described myself as a professional Christian, and when you're in the when you're in the pros, you're just kind of swimming in the water, and it's hard to get outside of it. I see a question here from Brad about the great dechurching. But I want to ask a question before I ask that, which is, was there anything from the data that causes you to reconsider or pause on some of the data that you collected from the great dechurching?
Ooh, that's a great question. That's a good one. I haven't even thought about that before. Okay, so the big conclusion of the great dechurching is a lot of people, what are called casually dechurched, which means that they just kind of slid away from religion over a longer period of time. And the reasons were things like they moved, they got married, they had kids, like they got a new job and they had changed their schedule or whatever, something like that, like the logistical things. And the more I look at this data, the more I think that for a lot of people, it wasn't necessarily the move didn't move them away from religion. It was like they needed an excuse to leave. And those things kind of gave them an excuse to not be that religious. Because the thing I always said about the great dechurching is the question you got to ask yourself is, why is moving enough for people to get out of faith and not miss it? And I think this becomes the other piece of that, which says, a lot of people didn't really care about it to begin with. They're just looking for, I call it like the cocktail hour excuse, which is like, well, why don't you go to church anymore? Oh, I moved. Not because I don't care about religion. You know what I mean? Like that's a different conversation. So I think a lot of people kind of use the casual reasons as sort of a shield against the inner reason, which is at the end of the day, they're sort of ambivalent about religion at best, if not slightly antagonistic against religion. That doesn't mean they're not spiritual, by the way. There's pretty clear evidence that spirituality is pretty rampant in non-religious people in this data, but that's not enough to get them to go to church. Clearly from this data, that's not enough.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks. Going to follow up with Brad's previous question. If religion and or spirituality are not providing meaning, and maybe you don't know this because maybe you didn't survey this, you can just conjecture, but what would you say is providing meaning for them?
I'm not entirely sure that a lot of people even think about meaning. I think, and we're doing a follow-up survey. Tony and I are going to put in the field actually next week. And we're going to just ask questions like, do you find meaning by walking in nature? Do you find meaning doing yoga? Do you find meaning doing crystals or meditation or whatever else? Because we really want to get to that question. Like maybe a lot of people just don't find meaning anywhere. Like they don't yearn to go back to the previous conversation. They don't yearn. And that's something that we need to know. Like a lot of, like for me, I think, like everyone's like, Tycho Brahe, we all have a God-shaped hole.
Yeah.
Is that really true?
Yeah.
I think the data is pointing to the fact that there's a not insignificant number of people who do not, in fact, have a God-shaped hole.
Right.
Or at least they've papered it up in such a way that they don't reveal that to us, giving them surveys, which I think is really kind of like a leap forward in how we think about faith. Is like, there's going to be a percentage of people who just don't give a rip. You know what I mean? Like they just don't care. And according to this, the duns are 33% of the nuns are 30% of America. So you're talking like 10% of America doesn't yearn. At least 10% of America just they don't have that God-shaped hole, at least. in a way they can articulate to us. It feels like by looking at this data.
Yeah, that's great. I think I'm going to lay out 3 more questions. I got one in the chat, and I got 2 more that came through. So first one, SBNR has been a category for a while.
Mm-hmm.
You'd probably know when. I'm guessing it was 90s or so.
Yep.
How does your data compare to SBNRs from 30 years ago?
I think it lays on pretty well.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the big difference that we're seeing, and I think this is the big change, is SBNRs are becoming even more anti-institutional as time goes on. One thing I didn't touch on here was we asked a big battery of questions about trust in different institutions. So like the media, the courts, big business, religion, all those kind of things. And I'm going to bet you the SBNR score very low on trust in all those institutions. So I think like the core of what SBNR has always been like kind of like what we would call like hippies or flower children or whatever. It's the girl who reads her horoscope, or the person who has crystals or something like that. But I think what we're seeing now is like they are becoming even more removed from religion. I think a lot of them used to be like sort of at least marginally religious, like they would go to church every once in a while. Yeah. They're moving even farther away because they don't like any institutional structures. And I think that's a bigger movement. That's a meta narrative in American life right now, is we're very bottom up, not top down. And I think that is what we're going to see even more with the SBNR group, is they're just going to be deinstitutionalized, anti-institutional. They don't trust any institution or any other person. And I think that's the problem with that group. And this is something I'm going to have to try to tease out is spirituality inherently individualistic, while religion tends to be in communal? Because if spirituality ends up being very individualistic, that's a problem. Because what religion does at its core from a social science perspective, it draws us towards other people. And that's a good thing for a whole bunch of objectively positive outcomes. If spirituality means you're less likely to go see other people, then spirituality is, I'm going to say it, just objectively bad, like neutrally bad. Like it has to be, because we need you to interact with people. So that's one thing I'm really going to look for with the SBNR group is like, are they more lonely than the other groups? Are they more isolated than the other groups? Are they doing yoga versus like walking in nature by themselves? That really matters when it comes to like figuring out if these groups are in trouble or not.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's great. This question, I love this question. This is actually from one of our brilliant Northern students out there on the West Coast, Dan. Do you think the Ninos would actually be even a larger group of people who do identify as religious or polled? And would it be the biggest group?
Yeah, so we actually did, we did poll religious people as part of this poll, right? Like almost 3,000, over 3,000 religious people were in the poll. What I'm actually probably going to do as an exercise at one point is like figure out what Ninos look like on these dimensions compared to religious people, to see how big the gap is, like the religious attendance gap, the prayer gap, the religious importance gap between Ninos and religious people. And is there, like, to me, like, is a rarely church-going Catholic a Nino? It is a Nino basically a rarely church-going Catholic. Like, what is the actual like empirical distance between those two ideas? Because in our heads, we always think like, okay, nuns are here and religious people are here. Right. I wonder if the Venn diagram actually overlaps a little bit, and the Ninos are a little on the religious side, and there's some religious people that are actually on the Nino side. That's a really that's a good thought experiment, by the way. Like I'm going to see like how much those two, because I really think in our heads we delineate like a clear, bright line. Nuns here, religious people here. But I think the reality is a lot of them are sort of between those two worlds.
Yeah. I guess what Dan was getting at. All right, last question here. This one's less of a social scientist question, maybe more of a cultural commentator. So you can put that hat on.
Yeah, sure.
What larger cultural forces do you think might be contributing to the rise of some of these non-traditional forms of spirituality? Crystals, horoscope, etc.
I think a lot of it is like we talked about, the deinstitutionalization of America and the lack of trust is a huge deal. I think a lot of people are like, they want to start something on their own and feel like they're following their own faith journey and making their own spiritual path. Like American individualism has always been really strong compared to, like, for instance, Western Europe. It's always tends to be a more communitarian kind of place, but I think it's just accelerated in the last 30 years. And I think what you're seeing is like, this is the offshoot of that idea. the idea of like, I don't need to go to your church to worship God. I can worship God by myself. And churches are corrupt institutions, and they're going to steal your money, and they're going to buy private jets, and the pastor's going to cheat on his wife and all those things. Like, I think that's all tied up in the deep skepticism that people have of other people right now, especially young people. Like, I always say, like, if you want to look at the most cynical generation, just talk to like 14-year-old boys. Like, they are incredibly cynical because they watch these YouTube videos all the time that say, did you really know what's happening with blah? And you really understand what this, like the cynicism gets clicks. And I think religion is being caught up in the larger cynical idea that it's just out to take your money and exploit you and oppress you and all those things. People don't. Here's the thing. I was talking to somebody about this the other day. When it comes to, like, we know that like birth rates are going down in America. It's actually a huge problem just from a pure like numerical financial standpoint. We need more young people to pay for old people retired. I can describe to you on social media how much it sucks to not sleep for 3 days. And everyone understands what I'm talking about. Or like, I'm puking because my kid's sick, or my kid's sick and I don't know, like I can describe that. You know what I can't describe on social media very well? How good my kid makes me feel sometimes.
Yeah.
When they do something amazing. Yeah. The cynicism translates through the internet way better than the optimism and the hope and the good feelings. And I think with religion, I think that's the inherent problem right now is you can describe to people what it's like when the church steals your money and abuses you spiritually or physically or sexually. You cannot describe to someone the ineffability of God in those epiphany moments you had when you experienced the divine in a way that it literally is beyond words. And I think that's the problem is you can't describe that part, but you can definitely describe all the crap the church did to you for the last 20 years. And I think that's the problem with a lot of things in life is we can only communicate half of the equation, and it's almost always the negative half of the equation, not the positive half of the equation. And I think religion's just struggling with that cynicism.
Yeah, that's insightful. Thanks for putting that hat on for a while, and for the social scientist hat, which Thanks to everybody who joined. And as we were talking before we started this up, I know many more people will be watching this in the coming weeks. Hope this is not part of the cynicism, but part of the hope.
Hope so.
What God's doing in the world. Thanks to everybody who joined us. Questions, Ryan. Thanks again for your research, and looking forward to seeing it as it comes out with you and Tony presenting and writing it up and.
So the plan for anyone who's interested is we're going to turn this into a book. The goal is to be like a broad book, like a trade book, not just an academic book for academics, but like a book for not just a Christian book for Christians either. Like just a book on called Making Meaning in a Post-Religious America. And it's going to be about this new phenomenon, how these people are figuring out their lives. And I mean, our goal is to be accessible to everyone from every faith background, every academic background. I mean, again, that's the point of all this work. If only 7 people read it, we failed. We want a wide audience. And again, it's not necessarily written for just Christians. It's written for everybody, but I think Christians can learn a lot about it because it's not written as like an evangelistic book. How many more evangelistic books do we need in this world?
Right.
There's like probably 15 or 20 written every year in American major presses. It's obviously they're not moving the needle big time. So let's try a different approach, which just describe the world. Like just lay it out there as best we can with the most rigorous data that exists and some of those rigorous methods that we can muster up right now. So I just hope this can be helpful, at least at the very minimum, help clarify things for people and help them see themselves in the larger, American society and American religious landscape. And for them to go, I'm not alone. There's a lot of power. Anne Lamott said the two most powerful words in the English language are me too. And hopefully a lot of people will read the book and go, hey, me too. Like I feel that way as well. So I mean, that's the end game for Tony and I in this project.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. Thanks for your work. All right, well, we hope to do this again, maybe with Ryan, maybe with somebody else, but it was a pleasure having you join us here at Northern Ryan, and thanks to everybody who joined us online.
Thanks, everybody.